there, and welcome back to the deep dive. Ever wonder how you know what you know?
Yeah, like really how?
Exactly. Not just facts, but how your mind even puts together the very idea of a thing, or cause and effect, or even just knowing something is true before you've experienced it. Today, we are taking a serious plunge into exactly that, guided by insights from one of the most foundational texts in all of philosophy.
A really foundational one.
We're going on a deep dive into the fundamental workings and, yes, the surprising limits of human reason itself.
That's right. Our mission today is to pull out the core ideas from this source material about what pure reason actually is.
Okay.
What it can genuinely claim to know independently of, well, any experience.
Right.
And crucially, the boundaries it runs up against. Because the sources make it clear. Human reason is naturally wired to ask these huge questions.
The big ones.
Questions it often, can't answer. We're here to figure out why and what that tells us about our own minds.
And this isn't just intellectual acrobatics, is it? The goal is really understanding the very structure of our thinking.
Exactly. The conditions that make any knowledge possible for us.
And what we can really stand behind as certain, totally separate from the input of our senses. Let's get started.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this right at the beginning. The sources highlight this fundamental dilemma. There are questions reason simply must confront,
Can't ignore them.
but which seem to completely baffle every intellectual tool we have. What kind of questions are we talking about here? Why are they so stubborn?
Well, this comes right out of the preface. These are questions that, as the source puts it, transcend every faculty of the mind.
Wow. Okay.
They tend to land squarely in the realm of metaphysics. Think about those classic philosophical claims, assertions about, say, the simple nature of the soul.
Right, the old chestnuts.
Or trying to argue for the necessity of a primal being, like God. The sources point to these as examples of, well, dogmatic claims that try to push beyond anything we can actually know through experience.
So reason just naturally goes there.
It seems so, in its natural drive for ultimate explanations. It asks these things, but finds itself kind of stranded because the answers seem to be, well, just beyond the reach of any possible experience we could have.
And the author here, he's not like those earlier thinkers who confidently claimed they could give you certain knowledge about God or the soul or the universe as a whole, going way beyond experience. He's taking a really different approach.
Totally different, almost like a confession of limits right up front.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He sees his task, this critique of pure reason, as something sort of imposed upon us by the nature of cognition itself.
Okay, so it's not just his personal project.
Not at all. It's less about building new knowledge out there, about the world, and much more about rigorously mapping our own cognitive territory.
Like drawing a map of the mind itself.
Kind of. And he sets out two essential conditions for this map making: certitude and clearness. He wants to show exactly what our mental faculties are capable of. And just as importantly, what they are not, where the boundaries lie.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. The source drops this comparison, this total flipping of how we usually think, comparing it to Copernicus.
The Copernican revolution analogy? Yeah.
How does that scientific revolution parallel what's happening here in philosophy? It sounds huge.
It is huge. And the analogy is incredibly powerful. Think about Copernicus, right? Trying to make sense of the planets.
Right, epicycles and all that complexity.
Exactly. The calculations were insanely complex if you assumed the Earth was the center and everything else moved around it. His genius was suggesting, wait, what if we're moving and the sun is the center?
And suddenly, things clicked into place.
Everything suddenly became simpler, more orderly. So the author here proposes a similar revolution for how we understand knowledge itself.
Okay.
Instead of assuming our minds must passively conform to objects in the world to know them.
Like a camera taking a picture?
Sort of. Instead, he suggests that maybe objects must conform to our cognition.
Whoa. So the objects have to fit our minds, not the other way around.
That's the radical proposal. This revolutionary perspective, he argues, is the only way to explain how we can have knowledge about objects, a priori knowledge that's certain and universal before we've even experienced the specific objects.
Like mathematical truths.
Exactly like mathematical truths. It shifts the focus from the object being known to the structure of the knowing subject, to us.
Okay, that is a big shift. Now, the source also notes this critique has a kind of double role. It's negative because it limits speculative reason.
Puts up fences.
Right. But it's also positive because it clears the way for practical reason. That sounds a bit abstract. Can you make that distinction clearer? Why does shutting down one kind of reason help another?
Yeah, it can sound a bit theoretical. Think of it this way. Speculative reason is the part of us that tries to gain theoretical knowledge about things beyond any possible experience. The ultimate nature of reality, freedom, God, the soul.
The big metaphysical questions, again.
Right. The critique's negative role is basically showing where those attempts fail, where they lead to unavoidable illusions or contradictions. It sets strict boundaries, says, nope, you can't know that for sure through theory alone.
Okay, so it limits our theoretical ambitions. How is that positive?
Because that limitation is actually really helpful for practical reason.
Right.
Practical reason is concerned with morality and action, what we ought to do.
Right, ethics.
And practical reason often operates in a realm that speculative reason cannot touch directly, or sometimes even tries to deny. For instance, speculative reason might look at the world of nature, see only cause and effect everywhere.
Like billiard balls hitting each other.
Exactly. And it might wrongly conclude from that, well, human freedom must be impossible because everything is just determined by natural laws.
Ah, so it could undermine morality.
It could seem to. But the critique, by making this crucial distinction between the world as we experience it, phenomena, which are governed by natural law, and the world of things as they might be in themselves, noumena, it removes that obstacle. It shows that while natural causality definitely holds for phenomena for the world we experience, it doesn't necessarily apply to things in themselves. And that makes room for the possibility of freedom, which is absolutely essential for morality.
Got it. So by fencing off speculative reason from claiming it knows everything, it protects the space for practical reason, for morality and freedom.
Precisely. It safeguards the vital work of practical reason.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like setting clear lanes on a highway so different kinds of traffic theory and practice can move freely without crashing.
It's a good way to put it.
Now, to build this whole system, the source makes some really key distinctions about different kinds of knowledge itself. First up, the classic one, a priori versus a posteriori.
Right, the absolute basics here. A posteriori knowledge is what you get from experience.
Like knowing it's sunny outside because I looked.
Exactly. A priori knowledge is what you know independently of experience. The classic example is knowing that all bachelors are unmarried. You don't need to survey bachelors. It's true by definition.
Okay, but the source adds another layer, right? Pure a priori.
Yes, a finer point. Pure a priori knowledge is knowledge with absolutely no empirical element mixed up whatsoever. Zero.
What's an example?
Well, the source gives the example every change has a cause. Now, the proposition itself seems a priori we feel it must be true universally.
Yeah.
But the concept of change itself actually comes from experience. We see things changing.
Oh, okay.
So a truly pure a priori concept or judgment wouldn't even rely on concepts derived from sensation or experience at all. Think maybe the fundamental rules of logic, or perhaps space and time themselves, as we'll see.
Gotcha. So pure a priori is like the absolute bedrock. No sensory input needed even for the concepts. Then there's this other crucial difference, analytical and synthetical judgments. How does the source define those?
Right, this is super important for the whole project.
Mm-hmm.
The source explains it by looking at the relationship between the subject and the predicate in a statement, like all X or Y. In an analytical judgment, the predicate Y is already contained within the subject concept X. The classic example, all bodies are extended.
Because being extended, taking up space, is part of what we mean by body.
Exactly. It just clarifies the concept you already have. It doesn't really add new information. It just analyzes the subject. That's why it's called analytical.
Makes sense. So what about synthetical?
Synthetical judgments are where the action is, really. The source calls them augmentative propositions because they add to your knowledge. The predicate Y is outside the subject concept X. It's connected, synthesized with it.
Give me an example.
All bodies are heavy. Heaviness or having weight isn't necessarily part of the basic definition of body in the same way extension is. You could conceive of a body without knowing it has weight.
Right, you discovered that about bodies, maybe through experience.
Precisely. It adds something new. That connection has to be made, synthesized.
And this distinction leads directly, the source says, to the absolute central question the critique is built to answer.
The question.
How are synthetical judgments a priori possible? The source basically says the entire fate of metaphysics rests on solving this puzzle.
Absolutely. This is the core problem. Analytical judgments a priori. Easy, just definitions. Synthetical judgments a posteriori. Easy, that's just experience teaching us things.
Right.
But a judgment that is both synthetic, it adds genuinely new information, it's augmentative, and a priori, it's known with certainty, universally necessarily, before any specific experience. How on earth is that even possible?
Yeah, where would that new information come from if not experience?
That's the million-dollar question. This is the core challenge, because if you can't show how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible, then key areas of human knowledge.
Well, they start to look shaky.
Like what?
Mathematics, for one.
Mhm.
Are mathematical truths just analytic definitions? Or do they tell us something real and new about structure? What about the fundamental principles of physics, like every event has a cause? Is that just learned habit, as Hume suggested, or is it a necessary truth we know a priori?
And metaphysics itself, obviously. Its claims have to be synthetic a priori if they're to be meaningful knowledge beyond mere definition or empirical observation. So solving this puzzle is crucial. Hume apparently came close to seeing the problem, but didn't grasp its full universality or find the solution.
Okay, so the stage is set. How does the critique go about solving it? The source dives into the different fundamental faculties our minds use for knowing. First up, sensibility. What does sensibility bring to the table?
Right, the faculties. Sensibility is described basically as our capacity to receive representations when affected by objects. It's our receptivity.
How we take things in.
Yeah, how sensory information gets to us. This faculty gives us intuitions. That's the key term here.
Intuitions, like gut feelings.
No, not in that sense. In this context, intuition means the direct, immediate representation of a particular object. Think of it like the raw data of sense. The source distinguishes empirical intuition from pure intuition.
Okay, what's the difference?
Empirical intuition is the actual sensory experience you're having right now. Seeing the color of this wall, feeling the warmth of your coffee cup. It has specific sensory content.
Got it. And pure intuition.
Pure intuition is the underlying form or structure of that sensory experience, independent of any specific content. It's the framework within which empirical intuitions occur.
And those pure forms of intuition are identified as space and time.
Bingo. This is where it gets really, really mind-bending.
I'm ready. The source makes some pretty radical claims about these, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, hugely radical. The source argues forcefully that time is not something we learn about empirically by observing events.
We don't abstract it from experience.
No. It argues time is a necessary representation that lies at the foundation of all our intuitions. You couldn't even perceive things as happening one after another succession, or even existing at the same moment, coexistence, without time already being the framework, the underlying form of your inner sense.
Wow, okay. And space.
Same deal, but for outer sense. Space is argued to be a necessary a priori foundation for outer intuitions. We can imagine space empty of objects, but we can't imagine an object without space.
So they're fundamental frameworks. But here's the really revolutionary claim, right? They aren't properties of things out there.
Exactly. This is the core idea of the ideality of space and time. The source argues they are not objective determinations or properties of things in themselves existing independently out there in the universe.
So space isn't a big container, and time isn't a river flowing independently of us.
According to this critique, no. Instead, they are forms of sensuous intuition. They are subjective conditions inherent to us, part of our cognitive structure, under which we can perceive objects at all.
Wow. So space and time are like the inherent goggles through which we have any sensory experience. We can't take them off.
That's a great analogy. They structure all our possible experience. They are ideal, part of our mental constitution, not properties of ultimate reality itself.
And the source argues this is the key to solving the big problem. This explains how synthetic a priori judgments are possible, especially in mathematics.
Yes, exactly. This is the breakthrough.
How so?
Because mathematics, the source argues, constructs its concepts within these pure intuitions. Geometry deals with the necessary properties of space, of pure form we possess a priori. Arithmetic deals with succession and counting in time, another pure form we possess a priori.
Okay.
So when a mathematician proves a theorem, say that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, they aren't just analyzing the definition of line, that would be analytic. They are constructing it, or cognizing its properties, within the pure intuition of space.
Ah. And because space is an a priori form of our sensibility, the truths discovered about it are necessary and universal for us, for our experience.
Precisely. The judgment is synthetic because it tells us something new about the construction in space, but it's a priori because it's based on the necessary form of our own intuition, not on measuring actual lines in the world.
So it's certain for our kind of minds, for human experience.
That's the idea. It accounts for the certainty and applicability of math to the world we experience, because that world is already structured by space and time. The source contrasts this with thinkers like Leibniz, who tried to intellectualize space and time, seeing them as confused concepts or relations derived from objects, which, according to this critique, just can't explain the synthetic, a priori certainty of mathematics.
Okay, mind officially a bit bent. So sensibility gives us the raw material, the intuitions, structured by these fundamental forms, space and time. What about the understanding? What's its job? How's it different from just sensing things?
Right. Sensibility is receptivity, taking things in. The understanding is, well, it's the faculty of thinking. It doesn't deal with intuitions directly. It thinks objects by means of concepts. It brings order and unity to the raw data from sensibility.
So it processes the intuitions.
You could say that. It applies concepts to them. The source talks about different kinds of logic here. There's general logic, which is just about the formal rules of thinking correctly, abstracting from any specific content like validity of syllogisms.
Okay.
But then there's transcendental logic, which is special. It focuses specifically on those concepts that relate to objects a priori, concepts that originate in the understanding itself and structure our experience before we even get specific data.
And these pure concepts of the understanding are what the source calls the categories.
That's the term. They are derived, the source argues, from the logical function our judgments take how we actually structure our thoughts. They fall into groups like quantity, unity, plurality, totality, quality, reality, negation, limitation, relation, substance, accident, cause, effect, community, reciprocity, and modality, possibility, existence, necessity.
So things like substance, cause, and effect. These aren't learned from experience, but are concepts the understanding brings to experience.
That's the claim. They are the fundamental pure concepts, the basic tools the understanding uses to make sense of the world. But here's a crucial point the source emphasizes. Categories alone, without intuition provided by sensibility, are empty.
Empty, meaning?
They are just logical forms, abstract structures. They don't by themselves give us knowledge of any determinate object. Knowledge requires both the concept from the understanding and an intuition from sensibility.
Ah, the famous line, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind.
That's the one. Concepts need sensory data to latch onto, to be about anything real for us. And sensory data needs concepts to organize it into meaningful objects and relations. You need both faculties working together.
Okay, so the understanding provides these organizing concepts, the categories. The source also brings in a really profound, maybe even more fundamental idea here, the transcendental unity of apperception. That sounds intense. What is that?
It does sound intense, doesn't it? But it's about something seemingly simple, the I think. Basically, yes. The source argues that for any collection of sensory data, the manifold representations given in intuition to become my representations, for me to be aware of them as belonging together in a single unified experience, they must all be capable of being accompanied by the I think.
So the fact that I can say, I think this, or I perceive that, and it's the same I having all these different thoughts and perceptions, that's the key.
That unity of self-consciousness, yes.
Yeah.
The source argues it's not something learned from experience. It's an a priori condition. It's the necessary ground that makes combining the manifold of intuition into concepts and judgments possible in the first place. It has to be there before the categories can even be applied, because it's what makes a coherent, unified understanding and experience possible at all. It's the ultimate source of unity in our cognition.
Wow. Okay, that's deep. The I think has to be able to attach to everything I experience for it to be my experience.
Essentially, yes. Yeah. It's the transcendental ground of unity.
So we have sensibility providing intuitions in space and time. We have the understanding with its categories, unified by this, I think. How do these pure concepts, these abstract categories like cause or substance, actually get applied to the messy, flowing stuff we receive through our senses, the sensory intuition? There seems to be a gap.
There is a gap. And the source introduces two more key players to bridge it: the imagination and the schemata.
Imagination, like making things up.
Not quite like daydreaming. Here, imagination is described as the faculty to represent an object in intuition, even when it's not present to the senses. Crucially, there's a transcendental synthesis of imagination that mediates between the pure concepts, understanding, and the pure intuitions, sensibility. It's a kind of active process that takes the raw sensory manifold structured by time and starts shaping it according to the rules of the categories.
Okay, so imagination is doing some work behind the scenes. What about schemata? That sounds technical.
It is a bit technical, but vital. The schemata are the crucial missing link. the mediating representations that bridge the gap between a purely logical category and a sensible intuition.
How do they do that?
A schema is essentially a rule produced by the imagination but guided by a category for how that category applies in time, which is the universal form of our inner sense and all appearances.
Can you give an example?
Sure, the category of substance is purely logical, something that is always a subject, never predicate. How does that apply to experience? The schema of substance is permanence in time. We recognize something as a substance in experience because it persists through changes over time.
Ah, okay. So the schema translates the abstract category into a time-based rule for identifying it in experience.
Exactly. Another one. The category of cause involves necessary connection. The schema of cause is succession according to a rule in time. We identify causality in experience when we see one type of event consistently and necessarily following another in the temporal sequence. The schema makes the pure concept applicable to phenomena.
Got it. Schemata are like the operating manuals for applying categories to our time-bound experience.
That's a good way to think about it. They are transcendental time determinations.
And this whole intricate mechanism, sensibility, understanding, categories, apperception, imagination, schemata, all working together, leads to what the source calls the principles of pure understanding. What do these principles achieve?
The principles are the payoff, in a way. They are the fundamental synthetic a priori judgments that express the necessary rules for how the categories, via their schemata, applied objects in time within the bounds of possible experience.
So these are the big rules that structure objective reality for us.
Yes, the source argues they are the absolute conditions that make a coherent, objective experience possible in the first place. They aren't just descriptions of how things happen to be, they are universal and necessary laws that the understanding actually prescribes to nature, understanding nature here, as the sum total of phenomena connected by rules.
What are some of these principles?
The source lists them systematically, corresponding to the categories. You have the axioms of intuition related to quantity, stating all intuitions are extensive magnitude, they have parts you can perceive. Then the anticipations of perception, quality, stating all sensations have intensive magnitude, a degree of reality.
Okay.
Then, maybe the most famous, the analogies of experience, relation. These state that experience is only possible through the representation of a necessary connection of perceptions. They give us first the principle of permanence of substance through time. Second, the principle of causality, that all changes happen according to law of cause and effect. And third, the principle of community or reciprocity, that all coexisting substances interact.
So substance, causality, interaction, these aren't just things we observe. They were a priori rules our understanding imposes to make experience coherent.
That's the argument. Without these analogies, we couldn't experience objective time relations, duration, succession, coexistence, and thus couldn't experience objects in time. Finally, there are the postulates of empirical thought, modality, dealing with possibility, actuality, and necessity relative to the conditions of experience.
Wow. So the understanding literally builds the lawful structure of the natural world as we experience it.
According to this critique, yes. It provides the universal rules that make nature, as a system of phenomena and time, possible for us to know.
Okay, so as I'm tracking this, the whole machinery of sensibility and understanding, working together through intuitions, categories, schemata, and principles, makes genuine, objective, synthetic, a priori knowledge of the phenomenal world, the world of our possible experience, possible and lawful.
You got it. That's the positive side of the critique, establishing how experience and science are possible.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Yeah.
What happens when reason, which seems to have this unstoppable drive for ultimate answers, tries to think beyond phenomena, beyond the limits of what we can possibly experience?
Ah, yes. Now we cross the border. That's where we leave the relatively safe territory of the analytic of concepts and principles and enter the treacherous terrain of the transcendental dialectic.
Dialectic. That sounds like argument, maybe illusion.
Exactly. This is the critique of the illusions that inevitably arise when pure reason overreaches its bounds. Reason, by its very nature, isn't satisfied with the conditioned knowledge we get within experience. This is caused by that which is caused by. It naturally, inevitably seeks the unconditioned totality of conditions.
It wants the final answer, the ultimate ground, the buck stops here explanation.
Precisely. It pushes for the first cause, the ultimate substance, the completed infinite series, the absolute beginning. This drive, while perhaps essential to reason's function, generates what the source calls transcendental ideas.
And these ideas, the source says, are necessary conceptions of reason to which no corresponding object can be discovered in the world of sense.
Right. They aren't just random fantasies or mistakes. They arise necessarily from the very nature of reason's demand for absolute totality, for completeness.
But they don't correspond to anything we can actually experience.
That's the problem. The sources identify the three main ideas of reason. First, the soul reason seeks the unconditioned unity of the thinking subject itself, trying to grasp it as a simple, permanent substance.
Okay.
Second, the world reason seeks the unconditioned totality of the series of conditions and phenomena, trying to grasp the universe as a completed whole.
Its total size, its beginning, its ultimate parts.
All of that. And third, God reason seeks the unconditioned condition of the possibility of all things, the ultimate ground of reality itself.
Soul, world, God. The big three of traditional metaphysics.
Exactly. The dialectical illusion kicks in when we mistake these ideas, which might function as useful goals or guiding principles for our thought, for concepts of actual objects that we can know speculatively, theoretically. Applying them beyond the realm of possible experience leads to unavoidable errors, paradoxes, and contradictions.
The source gets specific here, right? It talks about paralogisms, which are errors in reasoning about the soul.
Yes. Faulty arguments trying to prove the soul is a simple immortal substance based on the unity of the I think. The critique shows these arguments are fallacious. They confuse the necessary unity of consciousness with knowledge of an underlying substance.
And then there are the antinomies, these famous conflicts of reason about the world as a whole. What's the core problem generating these head-on collisions?
The antinomies are fascinating. They arise because reason, in its relentless search for unconditioned totality, tries to treat the world of phenomena. Remember, the world as we experience it, which is only ever given to us piece by piece, in a never completed, ongoing process of experience.
Right, we never experience the whole universe at once.
Never. But reason tries to treat this phenomenal world as if it were a completed thing in itself, a finished object. And then it tries to answer questions about its total properties. Is it finite or infinite in space and time? Is matter infinitely divisible, or are there ultimate simple parts?
These sound like ancient debates.
They are. And reason finds itself able to construct seemingly valid arguments for both sides of these questions. Thesis: the world has a beginning in time and is limited in space. Antithesis: the world is infinite in both time and space. Both seem provable.
And the other antinomies?
Same structure. Is there freedom in the world, or is everything governed by strict natural necessity? Is there a necessary being, God, as the ultimate cause, or is the chain of causes just contingent and endless? Reason gets tangled in contradictions because it's applying concepts of totality, which might belong to things in themselves, to the world of phenomena where they don't fit.
So it's like trying to measure the edge of a process that's still ongoing?
Kind of. It's treating representations as if they were the things themselves existing independently with definite totalities.
And the way out of this mess, the resolution the source offers, goes back to that crucial distinction you mentioned earlier, phenomena versus things in themselves, and the ideality of space and time.
That is absolutely the key to unlocking the antinomies. For the first two antinomies, the mathematical ones about the world's size and divisibility, the source argues that both the thesis and the antithesis are actually false.
Both wrong. How?
Because they both make the same fundamental mistake. They assume the world of phenomena is a thing in itself, a self-existing whole with a determinate size or composition. But if phenomena are just representations structured by our minds and the world is never given as a completed whole experience, then questions about its total size or ultimate parts are simply ill-posed. They don't apply.
Okay, that dissolves the first two conflicts. What about the other two, the dynamical ones, about causality, freedom, and necessary being?
Here, the resolution is different and really significant. For these, the source argues that both sides, thesis and antithesis, can actually be true, but only if they apply to different realms or aspects of reality.
How does that work?
Natural necessity, strict cause and effect, absolutely governs the world of phenomena, the world as we experience it in time and space.
Yeah.
That's guaranteed by the principles of understanding. So the antithesis, no freedom, only nature, is true for phenomena.
Okay.
However, this doesn't rule out the possibility of a different kind of causality freedom if it belongs to the intelligible realm of things in themselves, which are not subject to the conditions of time and natural causality. The thesis, freedom exists, could be true of us as noumenal beings, as things in ourselves.
So we might be determined as phenomena, but free as noumena.
That's the possibility the critique opens up. Similarly, While there might be no unconditionally necessary being within the chain of phenomenal causes, the possibility of a necessary being existing outside that series as a thing in itself isn't ruled out. The source specifically connects this possibility of freedom to the causality of reason itself, especially in morality, the experience of the I ought.
Which links back to practical reason.
Exactly. The critique limits speculative reason to make room for practical reason's insights.
Okay, that's a sophisticated resolution. Finally, in this dialectical section, what about the idea of God? The source calls it the ideal of pure reason and the ens realissimum, the most real being.
Right. The idea of God is presented as the concept of a single, unique, ultimate being that contains all reality within itself, the ground of all possibility, possessing the complete determination of all possible predicates. It's the ideal because it's conceived as a perfect, singular standard against which all finite things are measured.
Sounds pretty important.
And the source acknowledges this idea is incredibly useful, particularly regulatively, for thinking about the systematic unity and purposefulness of the world. However, and this is a major point, it forcefully argues that speculative reason alone cannot prove the existence of such a being.
It dismantles the traditional proofs.
It does. It offers detailed critiques. The ontological argument, proving God's existence from the concept of a perfect being, fails, it argues, because existence isn't a real predicate that adds anything to the concept of a thing. Saying God exists doesn't add a property to God like saying God is omnipotent. It just posits the subject with all its predicates.
So you can't define something into existence.
Basically, no. The cosmological argument, from contingency to a necessary being, is shown to ultimately rely on the ontological argument to get to a specific necessary being. And the physico-theological argument, from design and nature, might suggest a designer, but it can't on its own prove the infinite perfect creator conceived in the ideal, and again often implicitly leans on the ontological argument for that final step.
So the big takeaway is that these ideas, soul, world, God, while natural products of reason's drive for completeness, do not provide speculative knowledge of transcendent objects or their existence.
That's the conclusion of the dialectics critique. Speculative reason hits a wall here.
So, if speculative reason hits these walls, it can't know the soul as a substance, the world as a completed whole, or prove God's existence theoretically. Is that the end of the story? Is pure reason just doomed to stumble when it aims for the ultimate? Is it a failure?
Not at all. That's the crucial turn. The source makes a very important distinction here. While these ideas of reason don't have a constitutive use.
Meaning they don't constitute objects of knowledge for us.
Right. They don't give us knowledge of transcendent objects, but they have an absolutely vital regulative use.
Regulative, like rules or guides?
Exactly. They don't expand our knowledge beyond experience, but they serve as indispensable guiding principles within experience. They direct the understanding in its scientific work, pushing it towards greater systematic unity, coherence, and completeness in its investigation of the phenomenal world.
Okay, how does that work? It's like they function as a compass or maybe an ideal blueprint for organizing our knowledge, even if the ultimate destination, the unconditioned, isn't reachable through theoretical means alone?
That's a great way to put it. They encourage us to act as if, for example, the idea of God, while not provable, suggests we investigate nature as if it were the product of intelligent design. This teleological principle, seeking purpose and function, can be incredibly fruitful for scientific discovery, especially in biology, even if we don't claim to know there's a designer.
So it guides research without making a metaphysical claim.
Precisely. Similarly, the idea of the world as a totality encourages us to constantly seek deeper, more complete causal explanations, to unify laws, to push the boundaries of our understanding of nature, even knowing we'll never empirically reach a final, unconditioned first cause or a complete view of the infinite. The source mentions principles like seeking homogeneity, finding common underlying laws, and specification, looking for diversity in subspecies, as examples of these regulative guides derived from the ideas.
So the ideas aren't useless illusions. They're necessary navigational tools for science and understanding.
Essential tools for achieving the highest possible systematic unity of knowledge within experience.
Okay, that makes sense. And this brings us full circle, back to practical reason, doesn't it? The source says the whole interest of reason, both its theoretical side and its practical side, boils down to three essential questions.
The three big questions, yeah.
Yeah.
What can I know? What ought I to do? What may I hope?
We've spent most of our time on what can I know. The critique shows this is limited to the phenomenal world, structured by our own faculties of sensibility and understanding.
Right. The limits are now clear.
What ought I to do? That's the domain of practical reason, morality.
Yes, and the source argues forcefully, especially in later works, but hinted at here, that the moral law, the categorical imperative, is given by pure practical reason itself, entirely a priori, independent of experience or consequences. It tells us our duty.
Okay, so reason tells us what's right and wrong. What about the third question? What may I hope? How does that connect the other two?
This is where it gets really interesting. What may I hope connects knowing and doing. The source makes a powerful case that the moral law, this undeniable ought that practical reason gives us, necessarily leads us to certain hopes, specifically to postulate the existence of God and the immortality of the soul.
Postulate, like assume for practical purposes, even if we can't prove it theoretically.
Exactly. These aren't presented as theoretical insights or speculative knowledge. The critique already showed we can't know these things speculatively. Instead, they are argued to be necessary conditions for the possibility of the highest good.
The highest good.
The ultimate aim that morality sets for us. A world where perfect virtue, doing what we ought, is united with perfect happiness deserved by that virtue. Morality commands us to strive for this highest good.
Okay.
But, the argument goes, achieving this union seems impossible in this finite life through our own power or the natural course of the world. Therefore, to make sense of the moral command to strive for the highest good, we are practically necessitated to hope for or postulate conditions that would make it possible. Namely, the immortality of the soul, to allow for infinite progress towards perfect virtue, and the existence of God, as a moral author of the world who can ensure happiness is eventually proportioned to virtue. It's a hope grounded in the demands of morality itself.
So practical reason gives us a different kind of certainty, maybe? A conviction about things that speculative reason just couldn't reach.
Precisely. It's not speculative certainty, which requires objective evidence sufficient for everyone. The source calls it moral belief, or practical belief. It's described as having subjective sufficiency. It's convincing for the person committed to the moral law based on practical necessity.
A necessity born from our moral commitments.
Yes. The source even states somewhere that the moral precept imposes an irresistible constraint to believe in the existence of God and in a future life. It's a profound claim. Our moral experience provides rational grounds for belief where theoretical reason hits its limits and must remain silent.
Wow. So the practical use of reason extends beyond the limits of its theoretical use.
In a crucial way, yes. It gives answers, or at least necessary hopes, relevant to our deepest human concerns. And the source kind of frames this entire massive philosophical project, this whole critique, using the idea of the architectonic of pure reason.
Architectonic, like architecture, building a system.
Exactly. The art of constructing a system based on reason's inherent structure. Philosophy, in what the source calls its cosmic conception, its broadest, most human sense, is the science of the relation of all cognition to the ultimate and essential aims of human reason. Those big three questions we just discussed.
And this critique, then, is like laying the foundation, doing the site survey and drawing the blueprints before you can build the actual philosophical system.
Perfectly put. The critique itself is the essential propedeutic, the necessary preliminary work, the ground clearing and foundation laying. By rigorously examining the structure, the sources, the capabilities, and crucially the limits of pure reason, it prepares the ground for any future metaphysics that wants to be a genuine science.
And it shows that reason's primary job isn't necessarily grasping transcendent objects.
No, its primary occupation, the critique reveals, is really with itself understanding its own structure, and with bringing systematic unity and coherence to the knowledge gained by the understanding within the bounds of experience.
So, wrapping this incredible deep dive up, this critique reveals something really profound about us, doesn't it? Pure reason, our amazing capacity to structure experience and seek knowledge, is both incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. It builds the very framework for the world we experience, for science, for mathematics.
But it's also inherently limited. It builds this amazing house of knowledge, but it also shows us exactly where the walls are, the boundaries we hit when we try to grasp ultimate reality using only its theoretical power.
And crucially, understanding those limits isn't some kind of failure or constraint, it's actually a liberation.
How so?
Well, it shows us precisely what we can know with certainty through our faculties working together. It clarifies why traditional metaphysics got into so many endless disputes. And, maybe most importantly, it reveals how our moral life, guided by practical reason, points towards possibilities, necessities, freedom, God, immortality, that theoretical speculation alone could never securely grasp.
It really highlights this unique engine that is human reason, this persistent, maybe even relentless drive to seek connection, totality, completeness, always pushing even into realms beyond direct empirical experience.
Which leaves us, and you, with a fascinating final thought to chew on, perhaps.
Yeah.
If reason is naturally, inherently driven to strive toward the unconditioned, towards ultimate grounds, completed wholes, absolute unity, even if it cannot theoretically know or grasp these things speculatively, is that very striving itself a fundamental defining characteristic of what it means to be rational? Regardless of whether the objects of those ideas, soul, world, God, actually exist as objects in the world of sense. What does that innate, persistent, unavoidable pull towards the ultimate really tell us about the nature of reason itself?